Welcome to our conversation on human-caused degradation of biodiversity and ecological systems. I titled this as human-caused degradation rather than threats to biodiversity because when we frame these ecological issues as threats, it gives it a sense that these are things that are going to happen or could happen. Most all of these are issues that are contemporary, that are happening now, and we are indeed amidst a very, very difficult and challenging time on our planet. And so we're going to describe issues that are happening now, things that are addressable, but are definitely things that require and demand our attention. So when we talk about the degradation of biodiversity and ecological systems, we should first kind of add some value and understanding of what biodiversity is. When we talk about species diversity, oftentimes we talk about species richness and the diversity of different species within an ecosystem. That in itself is, to me, valuable, and I feel like it has intrinsic value. But oftentimes, because we've developed in this kind of progress-oriented capitalist narrative, we want to know what the value is of these diverse systems. So we want to give it an anthropocentric value. Here's a mosaic of different beetles. And to me, just the existence of these different species is valuable. They're all so interesting and unique. And if you study any one of these beetles, you could spend just about a lifetime understanding all the complexities of their life history strategies, the relationships between these beetles and other species in the community, and just how they've evolved incredible solutions to problems and difficulties and challenges in their evolutionary history. But as a human being in a society, in a community where we have a lot of tasks and things to deal with, there's other value to this population of beetles. You can see here that if you're studying something like forensic entomology, you would use things like beetles to understand the different stages of decomposition, and you could actually use the different communities of beetles and other decomposing insects to give an idea of the timeline of events of a decomposing body, or even where that body has been moved around to. And so when you understand these ecological systems, you can then use them to investigate things like crimes. In reference to the biomimicry and engineering aspect of beetles, we can see that beetles, some of them have evolved these incredibly strong external structures. And these are things that scientists and engineers look at in order to understand just how to make a strong structure. So this is a species of ironclad beetle. And these ironclad beetles have incredibly strong elytra and shells. And so in looking at that, we can see that there's actually different engineering problems that have been solved in this beetle's elytra. And those are things that we can borrow and then use in building our own structures, which will be stronger and lighter. When we have biologically diverse ecosystems, we can then study them and understand how those systems address problems like dealing with waste products. And so here we can see the result of a clear understanding of ecological systems. And this is a result of understanding the different filtration processes that occur in natural aquatic systems. On the top left, you have fish farming. And this fish farming approach in open water is using a whole cohort of organisms in order to deal with the waste products that are created by having fish in a concentrated area. And so one of the solutions is having these baskets of scallops. Those baskets of scallops are filtering out a lot of the waste product. You also have a bed of sea cucumbers and sea urchins below the fish cages, which are also dealing with fish excrement. And we even have seaweed that's absorbing nitrogen, which at high levels can be damaging in aquatic ecosystems. The seaweed's absorbing nitrogen and phosphorus. And so when we understand these complex systems, which have to be intact in order to study, we can then come up with modern solutions, sustainable solutions to things like agriculture or aquaculture, in this case the raising of fish, which is a very high yield protein. It gives you a high ratio of protein for the amount of food that you have to give it. It's much more efficient than something like a cow. So there's not just diversity of species, we also have genetic diversity, genetic biodiversity, the variety and diversity of a gene pool. And the diversity of a gene pool is important for a lot of reasons. Anytime a species undergoes a bottleneck event where their diversity is severely limited, the resulting survivors contribute to the gene pool, and oftentimes this limits the amount of diversity in the surviving population. And we've seen problems like that, but essentially when you have a limited amount of diversity in a population, you can be more susceptible to things like disease and more susceptible to ecological degradation because your populations are not able to withstand changes that they would be able to withstand otherwise. One example that we looked at before in class was the Tasmanian devil. Remember that Tasmanian devils underwent a strong reduction in numbers, a near extinction event, and at the hands of humans who killed and trapped and put a bounty on Tasmanian devils in their native habitat. They were killed in order to address a belief that they were somehow intrinsically bad organisms, and their habitat was also severely altered for human use. And so as a result, they almost went extinct, and only a few survivors contributed to the gene pool of the present-day population of Tasmanian devils. So what that means is that all of the present-day Tasmanian devils are extremely similar. They're very similar genetically, and that's a problem because when an individual has a face tumor and these Tasmanian devils fight, a cell from the face tumor can easily transfer onto the open wound of another Tasmanian devil, and that cell, that tumor cell, will continue to grow on the other Tasmanian devil because the cells themselves don't recognize that the new Tasmanian devil is a different organism. They're so similar genetically that the cell will continue to grow. And so the result is that we have transmissible cancers. We have cancers that can be passed from individual to individual, and this can only happen in this population where we've had an extreme reduction in numbers and an extreme reduction in genetic diversity. And so you can imagine, as ecosystem constructors, if you have a population of Tasmanian devils that is now ravaged by disease that shouldn't be happening in a diverse genetic population, they can no longer contribute to the kind of maintenance of a healthy ecosystem. So then you would have something like ecosystem degradation as a result of this limit in genetic diversity in this population. We also have diversity in ecosystems. Maintaining diverse ecosystems is likely one of the most important aspects of conservation. One aspect of ecosystem diversity that is notable and important in preserving is the systems of interactions. And this is something that we will likely look at more as this science becomes more commonplace. But this is an area of research that I have a strong part in. And I'll give an example here. In different rainforest habitats, you have different levels of human impact. On the left, we can see an example of a bunch of different birds. All those dots with letters on them are different species of birds, and all the lines between them are communications. These are signals going back and forth between these birds. And you can see on the left, in these undisturbed sites, these places where rainforest has been intact for a very, very long time and there's been no logging, you can see that there's a richness of communication between all of these different species. This is a mixed species communication network. Now, if you compare that to networks in areas that are logged on the right, you can see that there's a reduction in the number of species present, and there's also a reduction in the amount of communication between those species. And so you're basically losing a kind of a resolution, you're losing diversity, you're losing a richness in these communities, and these communities have a strong relationship with each other when it comes to communication regarding food and predators and keeping individuals safe and aware of their surroundings. And so we're just beginning to understand how these effects might further affect forest health, But I think that these communities, these interaction spaces, will become more and more important as a unit of conservation as we break open this new frontier in ecological research. Ecosystem services are these kinds of things that are not realistically replaceable by humans, and they're services provided by a functioning, intact ecosystem. For example, carbon sinks, trees and plants and growth in a forest all sequester different volumes of CO2 from the air, and it pulls that CO2 out of the air. It locks it into the mass of the tree, of the plant. Remember, we discussed where the carbohydrates come from in a plant. Where do the sugars come from? Where does the cellulose come from? Well, that comes from CO2 in the air. So if one of the major problems we're having now is CO2 in the air, well, these trees are locking it into their structures. They're pulling it out of the air, and they're turning that gas into a physical structure. And when those plants and forests, when they die and they get buried underground, that carbon is then trapped and locked away and taken out of the atmosphere. In this case, that would be a good thing, as we're going through a period of increased human-caused carbon emissions in the air. And you can see something like this forest, you can imagine the tons and tons and tons of carbon gas that has been pulled out of the air and locked into the physical structures of these growing organisms and these growing trees. The value of forests as a carbon sink alone is worth saving all of the rainforests on Earth, but that is something that requires broad understanding and collaboration in order to both understand and implement the kinds of protections that we need for large swaths of forest like this. So this is an intact community. Intact communities are so important because they have these levels and levels and levels of complexity that, again, all those levels of complexity contribute to the sinking of carbon. So you have layers and layers of plants, those are all pulling carbon out of the air. And when you have deforestation, you have the reduction in complexity, so then you have the reduction in the efficiency of these systems to actually lock that carbon away.